Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks. And yesterday, Wargaming released a Sandbox test server to see how changes to fundamental aspects of the game, namely high explosive rounds, would be accepted by the player base. Now, what is a Sandbox test server if you haven't seen a review of one or participated in one? Well, it's a special server that Wargaming have, which by no means is going to go into the game. There have been many Sandbox test servers that have tested changes that do not enter World of Tanks. And so please keep in mind that everything you see in this video is just being tested. There's no guarantee that it's going to go inside World of Tanks, and it's to see how a concept of what the possibility of World of Tanks' future might be, and if it would actually improve the game or it would harm the game in other areas. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this Sandbox test server for me is that was anyone really asking for high explosive round changes? Well, I guess a few people, but would it have ever been in the top 5 things that people hate about World of Tanks? I think most of the problems that people have with high explosive rounds inside the game are just when people just spam them at you and then they're consistently doing damage to you. But I think more importantly, really high caliber high explosive rounds. You know, your 150mm caliber high explosive rounds plus that just do a substantial amount of damage. So without further ado, let me try and summarize Wargaming's article here without necessarily reading all of it word for word, because as you can see, it's rather detailed. So firstly, let's talk about high explosive rounds work now. So if a high explosive round hits an armor, you firstly have a roll. Does it penetrate the enemy tank? If it does penetrate the enemy tank, then the full damage of the high explosive round will be dealt. So for example, on an E100 or a KV2, I believe that's about 910 damage, and you can roll minus 25% or you could roll plus 25% to that total. However, if the shell doesn't manage to penetrate the armor, then half of the total shell's damage is used in the calculation. Next, to figure out how much of that damage will be dealt to the tank, a weak point is trying to be found on the enemy vehicle. And this works by like a cylinder, or shall I say a sphere on the enemy vehicle. The shell impacts and then a sphere is created around the shell and it tries to find the weakest point of armor around it. Now, larger caliber shells have larger splash spheres, so to say, and so they have more opportunity to find a weaker point of the enemy vehicle, which is why that large caliber shells usually more efficient than smaller ones. In addition to this, currently high explosive rounds have got a penetration value, and even if the shell has not managed to penetrate the enemy tank, this is used in calculation when the sphere has managed to find the weakest point of the enemy's armor. Then this high explosive penetration value is squared off against the armor value of the enemy vehicle. A calculation is made, and if the enemy is using a spall liner, then this amount is reduced depending on how heavy that spall liner is. Wargaming go on to say that the calculation of this mechanics and most of the current aspects of high explosive rounds are outdated and don't match current realities of the game. And they highlight that the current 3 uses, at least in their opinion, of high explosive rounds are to reset the base capture, to finish off low health enemy tanks, and to deal damage in situations where it's impossible with other shell types. Of course, this is for high explosive rounds that are 150mm and below. For large caliber high explosive rounds, like on the KV2 for example, they're pretty much always replacing armor piercing rounds because they're just so darn efficient. So the whole idea of this Sandbox test server is to reduce the alpha damage on large caliber high explosive rounds and to improve the performance on lower caliber high explosive rounds, i.e. below that 150mm threshold. This kind of makes sense when I think about it in concept as to what Wargaming want to do. So to be able to achieve this, they're going to do some very bold things. Firstly, they're going to remove the ability to penetrate enemy armor with high explosive rounds. That's right, I'm not making a mistake here, they're not making a mistake here. They want to remove the penetration value of high explosive rounds. In addition to this, they want to change the amount of damage that the shell will do in distribution of the splash. Currently, the damage changes from 0.5 to 0.05 at the edge of the splash. They want to change this to varying from 1 in the center to 0.1 at the edge. Next, they're going to reduce the nominal damage of all of the high explosive guns. For example, a 76mm gun, like you would use on the T-34, used to do 156 to 260 damage if you managed to penetrate the enemy tank with a high explosive round. Now it will do 55 to 95 damage. If you're using a 120mm gun, like on the Tortoise for example, previously you would have done 440 to 530 damage. Now you'll be doing 180 to 190. And if you're using the real big boy high explosive rounds, like 150mm calibers, you would have previously done about 900. Now you're going to be doing about 320. In addition to this, Wargaming want to decrease the damage from the center of the splash, suggesting that the splash will become less dense. So I presume you're going to have to be more accurate with your high explosive rounds. And finally, they're going to change the tracing algorithm and the minimal damage. So damage dealt will be more predictable, not only due to the removal of penetration, but due to two other components. As they're changing the tracing algorithm, so the chance to find an enemy's weak point is higher and calculated more accurately, and that the ability to inflict minimal damage due to splash mechanics will be almost 100%. Whoa, I'm not sure what I think about that. Do you guys want to always get damaged by high explosive rounds, irrelevant of how thick the caliber of your armor is and how low the caliber of the enemy's gun is? And so to sum up, Wargaming suggests that these changes will mean that high explosive rounds will do less damage per shot, 66 to 75% less damage. The high explosive rounds will do less critical damage to internal and external modules and crew members. And for example, it will be impossible to set fire to the enemy engine if you hit the commander's hatch. Well, that's good in my opinion. But there will be virtually no cases when damage does not occur at all. The high explosive shells will expand their scope of use. Now they will be effective not only at large, but also small and medium calibers, and that weakly armored vehicles will no longer receive enormous damage from penetration, but they will still receive more damage than heavy tanks, but not 3 times more, resulting in the new role of high explosive rounds for resetting base capture progress, finishing off the opponents on low HP, and immobilizing enemy vehicles. But let's not just talk about it. Why don't I show you what one of the most beloved high explosive guns in the game on the M4 Sherman with the 105mm derp performed on the Sandbox test server. So here we go. We're playing in the M4 Sherman. This has to be one of the most played tanks in the game. If any of you watched my top 10 World of Tanks videos that I was releasing last year or even the year before that, you'll know that the M4 Sherman was one of the most recommended vehicles for any new player to play, and especially any free-to-play player to play, because the high explosive derp on this 105mm was just so darn good at doing consistent damage. Well, yeah, at least maybe not anymore, unfortunately, as we're doing 81 damage followed up by 94 damage to the Panzer IIIJ. Previously, I'd be very surprised if that didn't penetrate the enemy tank, and we didn't pretty much take off half of his hit points or even more. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, why does the Panzer IIIJ on the enemy team have 650 hit points? And why does my M4 Sherman, as we can see right here, have 770 hit points? Well, that's because this Sandbox test server also incorporates changes that Wargaming tested during the summer. Unfortunately, for the one moment that I'm away during the year and unable to actually cover the Sandbox test server, that's when it happened. I was away in Belarus, I was on holiday with Tanya, and so I was unable to actually feature the Sandbox test server last time, which changed the hit points of all of the low tier vehicles, as well as increased the alpha damage of all of the standard rounds in the game. But not the standard high explosive rounds. We're talking about armor piercing rounds here. And so, hit points and all of the extra alpha damage that standard rounds do, I'm not really going to be talking about that in this video. I'm going to follow it up with a subsequent video and just give my opinion about what I think about that aspect of the Sandbox test server, which has made it over. So yeah, all in all, we're just not really hitting very hard at all, are we? 118 damage, 125 damage. If I'd hit a T-28 with a high explosive round, I'd be very surprised if I hadn't done 200 to 300 damage to the tank, let alone entering the enemy vehicle and completely one-shotting him. So, I don't know what you guys think. Obviously, this just completely destroys derps. If I was using the 76mm with the armor-piercing rounds here, I would be able to obliterate these vehicles one by one. This high explosive round will no longer be able to just one-shot the enemy tanks if you fire standard ammunition. 165 is the most damage that you can do with this vehicle, and I presume if you hit a very thin amount of armor, that the gun, even though it doesn't have a penetration value, how weird is that when I mouse over this? Look at this, it literally says penetration 0. And there you go, I presume that's the highest amount of damage that this gun can kind of do. 158 against the ELC. Very thin armor that this tank hits. I mean, that's good news for the ELC, right? Effectively, all light tanks are going to get a tiny little bit of a buff when it comes to high explosive rounds because they're not going to be taking such huge amounts of damage there. But definitely, this is just awful news for people who like to play with high explosive guns, people who like to play the M4 Sherman, and I just don't quite know. Was this necessary? I mean, sure, I'd say that high explosive guns, like on the M4 Sherman, are pretty wild. I'd say guns on the KV2 are also pretty crazy as well. But was this really what needed to happen? Do we need to be just seeing the damage to be just so mundane, so boring, so consistent? I guess it makes sense, but it also just takes out a lot of the fun that people had in World of Tanks with the high explosive rounds. And this is like a whole lifestyle for players. High explosive rounds, it's not so much my jam. I mean, I'll always play with HE rounds because Twitch wants to see them so much and absolutely loves seeing them, right? But there are players out there who this is World of Tanks for them. They absolutely adore their high explosive rounds, and it's their meta. It's what they like to enjoy doing. Alright, so we fire one at the AMX ELC, we track him, we do 129 damage, then we're going to ram the other side of the vehicle, reduce them to 7 hit points, and then finish a round off into the side of the turret. Now we're going to turn our attention to the M8A1. But there is still one thing about these derp guns. Yeah, and that you can still fire gold rounds. Even though Wargaming have effectively nerfed the premium rounds on the previous Sandbox test server by increasing the alpha damage of all of the standard rounds, yeah, they haven't really changed things too much for the derp, so goodbye, sweetheart. 300 hit points would have been dealt to him, 237 because he was just shot by the M8A1 before we were able to finish him off. And I've been seeing a lot of that. I've been seeing a lot of people on the Sandbox test server with the frustration of no longer being able to do large amounts of damage with the high explosive rounds, instead just using the premium rounds on these vehicles and paying 5,000 credits a shot to do monstrous amounts of damage still. So let's see a little bit more about what these high explosive rounds are capable of. Alright, so 105mm caliber versus an ONI turret. Yeah, 11 damage. Alright, that's gonna take quite a few shots to be able to shut that tank down. Yeah, 8 damage. Okay, let's just speed this up tremendously and see what kind of damage we deal. Okay, 52 damage to the ONI. Alright, we finish it up with an 8 damage. Then we manage to hit a Black Prince. And look at all these damage rolls. We're at 78, we're at 92, we're at 30 damage, we're at 43 damage to the KV1S. We're at 35 damage to the KV1S. In fact, the only round in this game that actually did a substantial amount of damage was when I spent 5,000 credits on firing a premium round at the side of the ONI to do 392 damage at the start. So we're talking about 6 minutes here into the game. I've been continuously firing at these vehicles for 5 minutes and I've only managed to clock up about 400 damage. Yeah, ladies and gents, high explosive rounds will be pretty much dead against heavy vehicles unless you have very large caliber high explosive rounds. But what about a larger caliber derp, like 152mm high explosive main armament, the stock gun on the SU-152, which is one of the best things about the SU-152 is that you play with this gun stock until you have enough experience to be able to unlock the bigger gun if you want to. Yeah, well, now we're doing 69 damage to the side of an IS. Oh lord, okay, what about the damage that we'll deal to the enemy SU-152? Will our shell be able to hit? Very unlikely that our shell is going to hit here. No, it's just going to whiff over the top. Alright, let's speed this up a little bit again. Type 4 heavy, 81 damage. We just missed the side of the next shot. And so, what are people really going to do? Well, you know what people are going to do? They're going to dab the 2 key. They're going to spend whatever it is, the 5,000, 6,000 credits that you need to. Because why wouldn't I want to do 700 damage and have 250mm of pen? And then, yeah, kablamo, 687 damage. But these are premium rounds here. I have no idea why Wargaming are on a Sandbox test server testing high explosive rounds, while still leaving in the fact that premium rounds, which are super expensive, are now pretty much the only way to be playing these derpy guns. Sure, there's now an ammo disparity between the standard rounds. The standard rounds do 870 damage with 135mm of pen, but the premium rounds do 700 with 250mm of pen. Of course, the premium rounds on this tank, nearly with double the penetration, are going to be practically the only one that consistently works. And now that high explosive rounds barely work at all, you'd have to be crazy to want to use a large caliber high explosive round, or even any high explosive rounds. So if things stay as they are currently on the Sandbox test server, the age of the derp is dead. Which leads me to some other questions. Does that mean that they're going to also nerf the premium tanks that can use high explosive rounds? Are they going to nerf the KV-2R, for example? I think people are going to be rather unhappy if their KV-2R suddenly can only really fire premium armor-piercing rounds or even regular armor-piercing rounds, and its high explosive rounds are going to be practically useless. Next up, some of you might be asking, well, is this going to affect artillery as well? And how is it going to affect high explosive squashed head ammunition on a variety of vehicles? Well, currently, nothing is being tested with regards to those, and they're going to be tested in subsequent versions of the Sandbox test server. So stay tuned if you're an artillery fan or you're a Hesh tank fan, like the FV405, for example, as I'll be covering the changes to those mechanics as well. So my feedback from playing on the Sandbox test server is that, well, firstly, as I mentioned, high explosive rounds are just pretty much completely dead. You'd have to be a muppet now to fire high explosive rounds, and more often than not, I think the game will get even more pay to win with these certain derpy tanks. If you want to play them competitively now, you're going to have to load the gold. So Wargaming, if you decide to make these changes, please, you're going to have to adjust premium rounds on these vehicles as well, because it's just completely unbalanced with how much better these tanks get if you're spending copious amounts of credits on them. Next, I'd like to highlight that who the hell really even uses high explosive rounds to reset base capture points? Well, at least only uses high explosive rounds to reset base capture points. But the easiest way to do it is to shoot the tracks. If you shoot the tracks on the enemy tank, you will always crit them, irrelevant of the caliber of your gun. And if you crit the tracks, then you always reset the cap circle. Next, Wargaming suggests that high explosive rounds are now going to be used for finishing off opponents on low HP. Well, they already were. You just had to kind of know where the weaker points were on the enemy vehicle. There was no need for it to do some paltry low amount of damage, some tiny little bit of damage now. Sure, you'll be able to finish off tanks that are maybe on 20 hit points if they're an O-knee and you're an M4 Sherman by shooting them maybe 2 or 3 times if you get really unlucky. But more often than not, you're going to have to just waste a huge amount of time. I don't understand this concept of finishing off tanks that are on low HP, as if now they're on low HP that they've got some kind of special guardian shield and they're impossible to shut down. No, they've got just as much armor as they previously had. Maybe now they're going to be playing a little bit more defensively, but still, you can finish them off just with your armor-piercing rounds anyway. And finally, that the idea that high explosive rounds are now going to be efficient for immobilizing enemy vehicles. No, Wargaming, this is where you've actually made a real big mistake. You've reduced the damage of the high explosive rounds so much that now they can't even really have the alpha damage to be able to do the significant amount of damage they need to do to the enemy tracks to be able to take them off. So many times on the test server, I fired sometimes a large caliber derpy round like a 107mm caliber high explosive round at an enemy tank's tracks, and they just kept driving on. They didn't even take any damage. It didn't track them. It didn't even let the tank take any damage. And we're talking about even quite lightly armored tanks here. We're just able to keep plowing through. And so I feel like high explosive rounds are going to be even worse than armor piercing rounds, at least on the Sandbox test server, at being able to remove the tracks of your opponents, which kind of often defeats the point of a high explosive round. Which brings me to my final point. Did high explosive rounds actually need changing, ladies and gents? I don't think so. I would have never even put this in my top 10 things that is wrong with the game, or top 10 things which is annoying about the game. In fact, I think that the way that high explosive rounds work now are actually pretty fair, pretty interesting, and pretty good. I feel like if you manage to progress yourself into a weak point of the enemy tank, maybe you're in a Conqueror and you get up behind a more lightly armored medium tank or a lightly armored heavy, and you're just plowing your rounds into the back of the vehicle, you can amplify your damage by 20% at the risk that maybe you don't penetrate. It feels like a risk, but a decision that you must make. Now it feels like high explosive rounds are just a round that you will load when you know that you can't penetrate the enemy's armor and you just need to do a little bit of consistent damage to the enemy tank. Sure, the KV-2 has a decent win ratio of 51.41%, or the M1 Sherman, which also has a EU server win ratio of 51.41%. Hold on, that's completely Illuminati that these two high explosive guns have exactly the same win ratio. That's gotta be a freaky coincidence. But conversely, the high explosive derpy gun on the SU-152 is packing 49.13% win ratio. I really don't feel like high explosive rounds were an issue. I feel like this is an unnecessary change. I think the Wargaming should have just stuck to the changes to premium ammunition, or at least make armor-piercing rounds better so that premium rounds aren't so the only thing that you would want to load inside a vehicle. Now, I understand why they want to try and make high explosive rounds a tactical decision to make in the game, but I just really don't feel like it's quite there. I think they've taken them from being able to do everything that they suggested they wanted to make them be able to do, which they could already do already, and kind of just remove a lot of their use inside the game. And this is also going to be a huge nerf to vehicles that had special high explosive rounds, like the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen, like the T-49. How many of you love to use the derp on the T-49? That's pretty much going to be dead. The Sheridan, if you choose to use the derp gun and not the 105mm on that tank. Are Wargaming going to rebalance every single vehicle that has an option to use a high explosive gun? Because frankly, they're all going to be completely useless if the changes on the Sandbox test server occur. And so all in all, my opinion is that this Sandbox test server with the high explosive round changes just feel unnecessary. In fact, I think that not only do they feel unnecessary, they take a huge amount of fun out of the game for the very few tanks that could use high explosive rounds consistently to be competitive. I don't think any of those high explosive rounds were ever an issue. The only high explosive round that anybody ever had an issue with was with the Type 5 Heavy, but that since has been changed, and now while you can use the high explosive gun on that tank, you feel like you're quite happy when the enemy does do that because you can close in and manage to penetrate them a couple of times in retaliation. I just don't see the point of this. I don't think it was a change that needed to happen, and I would be very happy if drop this one altogether, or at least that they provide information about what's going to happen on the uncertainties, like the premium tanks that can use high explosive rounds now. Are they going to be able to keep them? What's going to happen to all of the vehicles that depended on high explosive rounds, like the SU-152, the KV-2? What's going to happen to some of the Hesh rounds on the British heavy tanks, or even some of the light tanks like the Rheinmetall Panzerwagen? Are they going to get buffs to make up for the removal of one of their specialities? It all just feels like wasted time to me. There's a lot of things about the game that could be tested, that could be improved upon, and high explosive rounds, at least for me, were not one of them. But anyway, I'd really like to know what you all have to say. Have you been on the Sandbox test server? Do you think that the high explosive round changes were fantastic? Do you look at this and you love your derp guns and you think that this looks like the apocalypse of World of Tanks? Let me know in the comments down below. And I'd like to finish the video as I started by letting you all know that this is a Sandbox test server. This is literally Wargaming testing a theory, and they want to hear our feedback, and so let them know what you think about high explosive changes. If you want the game to stay as it is, you want your T-49, you want your KV-2 to remain in the game as it is, then go and let them know, because seriously, they wouldn't be testing this if they weren't thinking about removing that capacity pretty much altogether. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.